Welcome to Positive Philter with your host, Philip Wilkerson, a podcast that focuses on friends, family, health, and career, with a little self-help along the way. Please join me in this journey for self-improvement, and I hope what I have to share will make you a better person, thus making the world a better place. I hope you enjoy the show. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of the world. It's Philip Wilkerson back with another episode of Positive Philter. I'm joined by a special guest. Well, everyone's a special guest because they take time to join me on my show. I'm joined by Delegate Dan Helmer, a local public servant here in Fairfax County, and just a pleasure to have him on this show. As you know, I've had a variety of public servants on my podcast, and particularly I had them on this podcast to share their journey into public service, but also give advice to those that are aspiring to get involved in their local community at the grassroots level or any level. And so really excited for this conversation. But before I get started, Dan, can you share the listeners or tell a little about yourself to get this conversation started?
Absolutely. I'm Dan Helmer. I represent the 10th District in the House of Delegates in Virginia, which is Southwest Fairfax County. It's where I live with my wife, who's a administrator in our public schools, and our two kids, one of whom is a recent graduate of one of our public schools and one of whom's entering his senior year. I'm the son of an immigrant. I'm the grandson of refugees and Holocaust survivors and immigrants. My dad's an immigrant and always grew up wanting to serve a country that welcomed my family. That desire to serve took me to West Point, tours on Iraq and Afghanistan, and eventually led me to serve our community a different way by running for and then serving in the House, where I've been for the last 6 years.
So, I always find it very interesting. One, thank you for your service. Where did your family immigrate from? And you say you're first gen American?
So my dad came here from Israel. My grandparents came here from what was then Poland, is now Ukraine, actually.
So I'm assuming, just making historical reference, they were escaping the pre, World War II things going on in that era when they came to America.
They were actually refugees post-war, so they survived in hiding in what is now Ukraine after the Nazis invaded. And then when the Soviets reinvaded, they were declared enemies of the state, and they ended up escaping to Munich. And in Munich, my great-grandfather served as a translator for U.S. Armed Forces at the time, and then ultimately came to the United States with his family. So they were out of a town that had 10,000 Jews prior to the war, a town called Zvolchev. Fewer than 100 survived the war. Only 6 children survived the war, 6 Jewish children, and my grandmother and my great aunt were 2 of those 6. So we're really very fortunate.
So, obviously that's quite a remarkable, when you have that historical background and generational impact. I think you understand the importance of service, and just I would feel like that would empower me to be like, it's quite a remarkable story that you have in your lineage. So as you were growing up, did you ever, were you ever thinking about getting involved? I saw that you visit the Boy Scouts. Were you active in your community?
I've always been interested in public service. At 16, I got to go to a football game at West Point. I was totally smitten with the idea of serving in the military, and so did that. I spent 11 years on active duty after West Point, and then we ended up in Fairfax County. My wife and I, our kids, we knew this is where we wanted to raise our family. At the time, I had a son about to be in kindergarten, a son about to be in second grade. So we were in the middle of first grade and rising into kindergarten at the time. We decided this is where we wanted to stay. My wife been a public school teacher, so she spent 10 years here as a school teacher. And then when we saw some of the things that were going on with our democracy post the election of Donald Trump, we got very concerned in a different way and decided to step forward and try to make sure that we did well by the community by preserving our democracy and also making sure that government worked well in a way that inspired trust. And that's how I moved from Army service to service in the House of Delegates.
Now, I don't know your background from military service. Was it just 0 to 100, or what was some ways that you dipped your foot into the community before running for the House of Delegates?
Yeah, we are movement from engaging with your neighbors to running for office. Isn't necessarily that big. And so, we were involved in local lives. I was, involved. I was working in a business at the time. So, great question, Phil. Prior to running for office myself, I was engaged as a member of the community. I involved in my local synagogue, and my wife's a teacher here, and certainly involved in things in the military community as well while I was still on active duty here. But the jump from politics was really sudden. I mean, after Trump's election and frankly, some of the things I saw that were really disturbing about undermining norms, the decision to run, it's about a 2-year journey to doing that, but it involved a lot of community engagement. I ran for office once and didn't win, and then a lot of members of the community asked me to do that for the state house seat that I represent today. Seeing the capacity I have for public service and wanting to see a different look in the House, and concerned that the person who represented at the time, been there for a long time, and perhaps it just the values no longer aligned with where the community wanted to move.
So with that being said, what were some of the lessons when you ran the first time? What was some of the lessons you learned running the first time? And what would you give advice? What advice would you give to someone that is interested in taking that leap like you did? And how would they, how would they best get involved?
Well, I think the first thing is, to your original question, it really is about community engagement and understanding your community really well, and taking the time to have conversations with your neighbors. And then I think, the decision to run for office is a big one. One of the challenges, of course, in politics is there are only so many offices. It's fixed. And a lot of times you have to wait for those opportunities to come around. And, but I think there are a million ways to be involved in communities, from boards and commissions to serving on your PTA to working with the Boy Scouts. So there's just so many ways of community involvement. Politics is one of many extensions of that. But I think, people are welcome to reach out to me anytime if they're looking for ways in which they can be engaged and helpful in the community. There are a tremendous number of ways. And then I think that's the start point, public service of any sort. And then having conversations with local elected officials, those who are involved in politics, to understand how to navigate some of the courses, I think can be really helpful to those who like to engage in that journey in the future.
And so, I'm always a person, I'm an educator myself. What are some of the hidden curriculum of almost like the Wizard of Oz, the things that the normal American does not see until they're in those spaces? I'll just give a quick example. I was on renaming task force. And when I was in the meeting, I was like, this is like my frat meeting. We do the Robert's Rule of Order. I thought this was a whole, grand rigmarole, and barely anybody was there. And I was like, these are decisions being made. I thought it was harder than it was, in a sense that it's not as intimidating. But what was some of the things as you got into the House, it was wow, this is beyond my preconceived notion of this space or this role?
I think the biggest surprise to me is when I conceived of serving as a legislator, I thought about the primary thing in which a legislator does is to pass laws and to vote on laws. And it's a critical component of what we do. It's so important. And in some ways, it's not the biggest piece of how one spends one's time. The number of connections you have to people who are able to help folks in the community when they're in a time of need is probably the way that my office spends the most of its time. When someone reaches out and says something's going wrong at my school, or the street, isn't looking good outside my house, or I'm having trouble with unemployment. And so that constituent services piece, the network that you build, is just such a critical part. It's probably the most rewarding thing I do as a legislator. And it's not something I necessarily thought of at scale when I was running for office. I thought, this is something you do and then you pass laws, but it's actually, you spend a whole lot of your time doing those services for the community, helping people fix the things that face them every day. And sometimes when doing that, you see that there are gaps in our law, and that you're able to pass really effective legislation that helps the community and deals with things like rising costs or public safety or education, all things that we care about deeply here in Fairfax County.
Also, another thing I thought about, as there's so much going on in the world, obviously, and so much going on in our community, what ways do you stay informed about what's going on, as there's multiple issues that you could focus on, right? As you said, the constituents bring lots of issues. So how do you just kind of just stay in the know as a local public servant?
One of the big things is we send out an email every couple of weeks, more often when I'm in a session, a little bit less often in session, about the work we're doing. People respond to that. We hear from them. They reach out. So my goal is always that people know how to get a hold of me. I've handed out my cell phone to tens of thousands of people. So people just call us. They tell us. We go out and visit, go and knock doors just to say hi to people. So those are all ways in which we do it. And then, of course, I read the local news myself and all of that. So if there's something that just fell under our radar and we weren't aware of, that's another way we pick things up.
Now, transferable skills, talking about career, right? Obviously, I think the military, shout out, like I said, I have a great respect for the military. My dad was Army Colonel 30 years, so I've chose a different path, but I have a great respect for the military. What were some of the transferable skills from your military experience that has made you prepared for your role in public service?
I think there's a lot. I mean, the military is a great way to hone your ability to work with people who come from different backgrounds. It's a place where you don't necessarily ask somebody's political background or what their political party is, but you find people that you may agree with or disagree with on matters of politics, but find common cause and work together to get things done. I think that's an incredibly important component of public service. I think that you get lots of skills in terms of like, hey, how do you react to new and incoming data? When I served in Iraq, when I served in Afghanistan, the ground truth changes and you have to be aware of that. And while the types of changes are very different in our homes, in our communities, fortunately, the idea that you can take skills about how do you react to information that changes and develop new opportunities and new options around that is something that really transfers to how you legislate.
And then also, someone, I'm assuming, I'm already getting the vibe, you're a growth-minded person. What was one of the skills that once you were in public service that you're like, I need to grow in this area. This is outside of my comfort zone or outside of my already existing skill set that I need to work on and improve on in this space?
I think one of the things that I imagined is that all this infrastructure exists for you, like you get elected to the House of Delegates and you step into an office and it's all set up, right? And the reality is that there are 100 different delegates, there are 40 senators. There is no one way that an office is set up. There are not like standard operating procedures or anything. So you have to build it from scratch. And so, I run a small business with a couple of partners when I'm not in the House. And I actually found that a lot of like the learning and growth was all about how do you set this all up essentially from scratch to make sure that all of the incoming you can address. And that was particularly challenging during COVID. On average, we get a few constituent requests in any given month. It's a handful, right? And our offices are set for that. When COVID happened in the beginning of the first year of my first term, we went from, let's say 10 or 20 pieces of like constituent service outreach in any given month to 10 or 20 a day. And so just having to build to address that, to make sure people were getting what we need, to build ourselves as a community engagement center. We started doing a volunteer program in 2020 as we were talking to people as they were coming over. We were starting to realize people were reaching out to us just because they were lonely. And so we started a check-in program. We got volunteers to reach out to people who couldn't get out of the house, 6 months into COVID because they were elderly and things like that, and just to touch base and see how they're feeling. And it was that kind of stuff that just there was no precedent for that we had to build and learn around. And some of that architecture that we built really enables us to stay very connected to our constituents. And there are some technology evolutions. I was one of the leads in helping convince the House that we need to modernize our communications. And so now we have the ability to like much more effectively track cases. We didn't really have a case management system or anything like that. And so now we just have a much better way than a spreadsheet to check like, okay, Philip reached out to me about something that's going on. It's something that we can help with. Did we connect Philip to the right person at the DMV? Did the issue get resolved? If not, what else do we have to do to make sure that people are getting the help that they need at our office?
I also believe, like when I enter new spaces or try to learn new things, I look for mentors. I look for someone that's like, well, there's someone in a position that I would probably aspire to one day, maybe ask them for guidance. So as you were getting, into public service, who was someone that, kind of set a precedent that helped you, you could ask them questions to be somewhat of a guide, as you learn something new?
Oh, it's great. I mean, I've had the chance, I have people who were elected like recently before me. So when I sat in the House of Delegates for several years next to Schuyler Van Valkenburg, who was 2 years ahead of me. We've got great local public servants in Fairfax County who've served years in the House of Delegates. So you get a chance to learn from them. We've got folks like our, Kathy Smith, who's been a supervisor for years in the western part of my district, who I reach out to and talk to. So there are a lot of people who've been doing this for a long time. And it is funny, though, how quickly you get senior in a place like the House of Delegates. When I came in, I was the 79th in seniority. Basically, it's all tied. It was tied from 77 to 100. We're all the same. And I'm now the 39th most senior member of the House of Delegates out of 100. So it just changes very, very quickly. So you go from the person who is seeking that mentorship and working with people who've been there before you to one who's like now able to offer that. And it's one of the things that benefits constituents from having someone who's been there for a few cycles.
That's very crazy to think about how quickly it's like, oh, that someone's asking me for advice now. I've just been here like 2 years. What was one of those moments where you're like, it kind of, when you say going up and ranking, and that could be a tangible way, but what was there like a breaking point when you were like starting to feel comfortable yourself in that, and like, doing the work I wanted to do? It clicked for me. My question was, when was there a moment where it clicked and you felt like, I know what I'm doing now, people are looking to me for mentorship, like, or were you always confident as soon as you got elected?
There's a lot that goes into prepping you for like your first, session of the House of Delegates. But I think that one of the most meaningful things for me was in my first year in the House of Delegates, right before I got sworn in, a constituent approached me who had been the victim of a sexual assault on a college campus. And in talking with her about her situation, what she really wanted was to do things legislatively that could prevent others from going through what she did. And we reached out to a bunch of advocacy groups to understand what the opportunities were to combat sexual assault on college campuses, identified that making sure that those who were under the influence of alcohol or broke a curfew or committed minor offenses felt safe in coming forward if they've been the victims of assault is really critical to encouraging victims to report, is a really good way to identify predators who go after mostly women on college campuses. And so basically passing one of these bills that promotes amnesty for minor offenses when reporting an incident of sexual assault is just really important. And so we decided to do this. We pulled this bill together, went through the legislative process, we're having lots of conversations with legislators, and we got it to a really good place and got it passed on the floor of the House of Delegates, and ultimately signed by the governor. But when we passed it, she was in the gallery to see this. Is a very empowering moment for this woman who was a victim of a sexual assault. And I think that was like this moment that's like really powerful to me still, of like, we're making a change for hundreds of thousands of people in Virginia that's going to positively impact their lives. But there was a person who themselves had suffered because of the lack of this type of policy. And she got to be there and feel empowered by her involvement in the legislative process. That to me was like, okay, I get what this is about. It feels very, very good. And we were able to do the thing in my first year to successfully enact a piece of legislation that wouldn't have happened but for my having been her legislator at that particular moment in time. And when she came forward with her story, instead of saying, oh, thank you for telling me, to say, okay, how can we do something together about this, and going on a journey to make that happen.
Yes, thank you. That's a very powerful story, and sorry for her, the trauma she must have gone through, but also how she was resilient to channel that into social change is probably very empowering. I remember you shared a story. You came and talked to my son's Boy Scout troop, and you did also share like the frustration of wanting to do something but not giving up. I think you said you're like a dog with was it the bone? I don't know.
Dog with a bone. Yeah, dog with a bone. The work I've done on infertility coverage for folks in Virginia who want to have a baby and are unable to do so for medical reasons. And I am now in the 6th year of introducing legislation to make that possible. But I think we are very close to getting there. Among other things, I asked to be included in the Health Insurance Reform Commission, which I now am. We are now in the midst of updating the coverage requirements in Virginia. We have a recommendation in the bill that I finally passed that says we're going to go forward with this, and subject to a few administrative steps, it seems like we're really on the path to changing this coverage in a very positive way. But it's taken 6 years of work. Another example of this, as I mentioned, that bill I passed earlier in the Senate. When I passed the bill, they carved out VMI from the bill on the sexual assault prevention bill. I thought that was crazy at the time, but it was the only way to get the bill passed. And I spent 3 years fighting to remove the exemption for VMI and finally successfully did that. So sometimes you just got to keep going at it. Sometimes you need to build coalitions. There's bills I've worked on for 2 years, 3 years, 6 years. There's bills that we plan on bringing next year that they'll be the 7th year in some way of shaping on them. So sometimes change doesn't move as fast as you'd like it to. Sometimes it just takes a while to get the policy right? It's not always bad when a bill doesn't pass. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of work to make sure that we're not, sometimes we know what the result we want is, but sometimes the law isn't necessarily the right way to get there, or the policy is just very complicated. And so tenacity is a really important part of legislating.
Yeah, I was about to, and that was my part too, is what, like, thinking about it. Would it be advice if, you want to make a change, that you stay firm, or like, was there ever a point where like, all right, it's never going to get past this one, I got to drop, or I'm just going to keep on redoing it until it gets done? I don't know. Is that an advice that or not advice, but mindsets that most public servants have, right? Like, you come into it with, like, for me, I would have like one real core value, like education. And that's like my thing, my hill. And I had to just be okay with other ones not getting passed the way I want. But like the ones that relate to education, I'm just never going to stop with that one, right? Is that some advice that some people would have, like have some core policies that no matter what, you're going to keep on trying? Or how would how do you build that tenacity, but also understand, like, kind of like realistic expectations, or set goals for yourself, not for yourself, but like set goals for things that you really want to tangibly make an impact?
Yeah, I think it's really important to establish where you're going to become an expert on a policy standpoint. And so I work a lot in public safety. I work a lot in education. I work a lot in voting rights. Those are all places where I work. There are other areas that I get pulled into, and happy to do that. And sometimes you have like niche areas of expertise that come from your work in the private sector, just because you've been involved in negotiations about a law in the past. Those are all pieces of it. I think there's two pieces. I think one, tenacity where it's warranted is really important. There's sometimes legislation you bring forward that, for whatever reason, there wasn't enough time in the legislative calendar, the policy isn't quite right, the stakeholders weren't aligned, it costs too much, that you need to go back to the drawing board. And every once in a while, something comes forward. It was an idea from a constituent, or an idea you had, or something brought to you, and you realize, actually, it's probably where we, not where we should go, and therefore you don't bring it back. And so, it's sometimes confronted with new information, you need to be willing to change your mind as well. And so tenacity towards a good end is great. Sometimes I have seen where people are tenacious and everybody, kind of groans. They're like, oh, that's this bill again, right? You're like, this isn't a good idea. It's not going to pass. They need to move on. It's not going to do the thing they think it does. And so you got to be willing to respond to like new information, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
How, as someone that's at the state level, how often do you intersect with the federal level? And when you do go, if you do have that intersection of opportunities that you go to the federal level, is it almost like, and this is being naive, is it feel like JV to varsity, like this is the new league, the big league is, the federal stuff, or it's all, perspective and relevant?
I mean, one of the things that's really exciting about serving at the state level is, while our federal government is dysfunctional right now, and particularly our Congress and the White House are not delivering on behalf of the American people, I get to be part of a fast-moving state government and Democratic majority in the House in Virginia that is able to deliver every day for Virginians. And so while we see absolute stasis on addressing costs and addressing issues with democracy, when we see absolute stasis in terms of education and they're defunding the Department of Education, I get to be part of a government that's delivering solutions. So actually, a lot of the times it feels like the JV's in Washington and we're in the varsity level trying to deal with the problems that Washington is creating because we don't have Washington focused on the right things right now. Too many showboats, not enough workhorses, and it's great to be where the rubber meets the road in terms of how do you actually turn around, look at your community, and say, I did something today that made a difference.
And to that point, right? Talk about pacing and is it really like that, like at the state level and maybe even the county level, you really get to get your hands dirty and do more, in your opinion, from just, and I'll say this, maybe this is an anecdotal thing from what you see at the state level and county level, from your experience, you get to do a lot more, feel more involved.
Yeah, we pass our budget in time at the state level. Congress hasn't done that, and basically in living memory, we passed more laws last year than Congress will pass this decade. And so it's just much more fast paced, and we do it in a 2 or 3 month session. We have one of the most efficient legislative sessions in the country. And so, Virginians should feel good that that they're getting the work that they deserve out of the legislature in a time, in a fast time and pace. And then we come back to our community and we work. I mean, we are paid a somewhat nominal amount as legislators. It is a part-time job, and we're teachers, we're business owners, we're all sorts of, we're members of the community who do this out of a sense of public service.
I love that. Also, talking about agency and opportunities, I think about I work, like I said, state public institution, that if things federally happen, it does trickle down and affect us. So does the state, and in your role, do you feel it a lot from what's going on nationwide to your, colleagues, and always having to pivot, or, does it, or is there still a little bit of separation between what's going on federally and then what you have agency and control over within the state?
Well, I'd answer that is, we really were excited over the last, since I've been in office, I'm really excited to take what's been happening at the federal level and translate it into really good benefits for the state. And what's devastating about what's happening in Washington right this moment, especially with the bill that President Trump just signed, so-called Big Beautiful Bill, what it really is a big BS bill that is going to cut Medicaid, cut SNAP, make things more expensive, increase our national debt, decrease good educational outcomes for our children. And at the state right now, we're just playing in a triage level. We have a governor who's in denial about it, and Republicans in the legislature are just in denial about it. And the reality is that we've never seen such massive cuts to healthcare and education as we're seeing through this bill. As you may have seen, the Supreme Court just greenlighted yesterday, shuttering the Department of Education. So we're going to see the cost of attending higher educational institutions go up for parents here. We're going to see decreased funding to our public schools. We're going to see decreased funding to healthcare, all for a few tax cuts to billionaires. And at the state level, it's really devastating to be in a position where we're just trying to figure out how can we plug the gap. We expect the federal government to be working on behalf of the American people. And right now, we're in a situation where the entirety of our state government, particularly after I hope what happens in the elections this November, Virginia happens, where our entire focus is just how do we mitigate the damage coming out of Washington? And we prefer to have governing partners in Washington, not people who are trying to hurt Virginians.
So, and I'm a person of optimism. And when I say that is there a cushion like that? That means, I've always said, then what do we have agency and control over, right? It could be scary if it's, the federal stuff. So is it really important to be thoughtful about our local officials, as well as, is there empowerment in that, there is protection within the local communities to mitigate some of that damage that's going on federally? Is there still that hope and optimism, or I'm just being kind of naive?
It's never been more important that we have thoughtful people in the General Assembly, in local government, who are going to do everything they can, respectful of taxpayer dollars, the hard work that each of us does for our money to make sure that we mitigate the impacts of what the federal government is chosen to do right now. And so it's just never been more important than ever. And I am hopeful that the sound fiscal management of Virginia over the last 4 years under the Democratic General Assembly, or the last 2 years in the Democratic General Assembly, which has ignored irresponsible requests to raid the rainy day fund, the realities of the budget that we passed in the Democratic controlled legislature is going to do a huge way to making sure we can mitigate some of those harms and actually find ways to do new good. It is going to be a lot of work, and it's never been more important than ever that people are involved. You go out, you vote this November. Who is the governor of Virginia, who controls the General Assembly will have a huge role in determining whether we have a sunny outlook in Virginia or whether the outlook looks much like it does in the states that are, don't have an answer to the gutting of public health and education funding.
Yeah, thank you. So, I'm always the proponent, get out there and vote. A voteless people is a hopeless people is one of our alpha things. And so I definitely, that's my like, not North Star, but that's my optimism was right there, is that we still have agency within our community. It's almost like that dog meme where it's like, this is fine, the house is on fire, but like we can figure it out. All right, so my last question is just last parting advice. I got, one more segment, but what is parting advice just for the average American about what's going on? What can they do to whether stay informed, make a difference, change, just like, as they see all this going on in the world, as a public servant, give advice to the average day Joe, me.
Democracy is all about being informed. Our democracy is at risk in a way it hasn't been before. What is happening right now is not normal. We have folks undermining or trying to undermine the ability of people to vote. We have people who are not focused on solutions that work for the American people. We see our costs rising. We see education funding going away. We see the NRA and gun lobby having influence over policies that make it more dangerous in our streets, more dangerous in our schools. And that can only happen when people aren't involved and they say my vote doesn't matter. I've seen elections that were lost in a tie vote where we drew the winner out of a hat and actually out of a pitcher. And so your vote matters, your engagement matters, being informed by credible sources about what is happening matters, what's happening in your local government matters, what's happening in your state government matters. There is not enough news reporting on that. So you have to go out yourself, you subscribe to your legislator's newsletter, subscribe to your local news source, make sure you're going beyond the social media algorithms that are feeding us misinformation, trying to change our outlooks in ways that are really negative for democracy. I think that's on us. We have to take ownership of that collectively. And so I think it's on all of us to go find the facts, work with local government, work with state government, hold people accountable when they don't do the things they say they're going to do, and make sure that our government and our democracy is fighting for us.
I love it. All right. So we're going to go to my last segment of my show. It's called Shot for Shot. I get to ask you a random question. You get to ask me a random question. You want to go first or I go first?
Go ahead. You go first. I'll follow you.
Okay. I'm just going to say, are you more of a college football fan, NFL fan?
Totally an NFL fan. I am a diehard Eagles fan, so this has been a good year for me. So there you go. I actually was able to go up to the championship game. It was a good year. How'd you do on your March Madness picks?
Okay, so my bracket is done. It was trash. I'm a UNC fan, and that goes without saying. And then my Commanders, born and raised DC or military brat, but ended up here. You know how that went with the Commanders versus the Eagles. And that was
I know how it went. It went perfectly well.
Well, I know that we don't agree on that, but we can still be civil.
That's right. So I ran for office myself. I never met someone who I agreed with on every issue.
There it is. All right. So this is the part of the show called Shout Outs and Plugs. You get to show love to anyone you want to show love to, and then plugs. These are things that I'll make sure to put in the show notes, links, resources, ways to follow up with you to get connected. So shout out, show love to anyone, and then things that I should put in the show notes for follow up for people's awareness. The stage is yours.
I'm going to shout out my wife, Karen. She's one of the hardest working public officials out there, and being the spouse of a politician is no joke. And she's supportive every single day. It was part of the reason we got into this. in the first place and is an amazing public servant in her own right. And the fact that we get to do public service for our community together in different ways is amazing. And so I'm just grateful to have an amazing woman who I've been married to for 20 years in my life who's willing to go on this journey together. So that's my shout out. And my plug is, I think I've made my plug. It's, please get out, be involved, reach out. If you're my constituent or even not, you can reach me anytime at Helmer at house.virginia.gov. We want to hear from you. And if you heard something today that is of interest, or you have more information, or you have an idea for a good piece of legislation, so many good ideas for legislation come from people reaching out and saying, hey, did you know this is a problem in Virginia? We're really grateful to have your help. So my plug is for your involvement in public service too.
Well, thank you so much. To listeners, please take Delegate Dan Helmer's advice and get involved. I'll make sure to put the links and resources in the show notes. Also, I think I need to update myself. I've been subscribing to a bunch of newsletters. I need to make sure I subscribe to yours as I get my channel from different sources. As you know, every episode is dedicated to the memory of my father-in-law, Jeff Kirsch. So please consider donating to the Jeff Kirsch Anti-Hunger Fund. And if you're a part of the Mason Nation, please consider submitting a patch for Patriots to send a nice, kind note, because kindness is really important here at George Mason. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for engaging, and take care.
Thank you for listening to Positive Philter, a podcast that focuses on family, friends, career, with a little self-help along the way. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your family and friends, and like the Facebook page, Spreading Positivity of Movement. Thanks for listening.